Good evening. Welcome to Center Place. Welcome to our Tuesday night History, Theology, and Philosophy series. As usual, this is a live interactive presentation. Leandro is here on the back end as he is watching the comments on YouTube and eventually also on Facebook. We're continuing to have problems with Facebook's new interface. But he's monitoring where he can, and when you write your questions down, he'll take them, and at the end of the formal lecture, we will have a Q&A time. As always, we invite you to view our total catalog of lectures, which keeps growing week after week. You can access those at centerplace.ca/lectures. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, which has been the more stable component of our live stream, and there's all kinds of new content there quite regularly too. Our lectures are listener supported. We always appreciate your donations. You can find out how to do that at centerplace.ca/donate. We normally would announce what our next lecture is. Next Tuesday, because of the US midterm elections, we're going to skip our regularly scheduled program. We'll resume again the following week, so 2 weeks from tonight, and we will announce that lecture when that comes. Our topic tonight is monarchy in Mormonism, and I want to begin by talking a little bit about monarchy. Here in Canada, which is one of the Commonwealth realms, we have been thinking about monarchy because of the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, who served, as maybe people in the US maybe don't know, as the Queen of Canada from 1952 to 2022. So how does the constitutional monarchy work in Canada? Well, compared to Britain, where the royal family lives, the presence of monarchy in Canada is comparatively light. Nevertheless, the Queen is on the money. There's a bunch of things that are named for past and present royals. One of the expressways coming into Toronto is called the QEW, which is named not for the most recent Queen Elizabeth, but actually for Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, who died before her, anyway. Victoria Day is a holiday. When you go to Queen's Park here in Toronto, which is a park around Ontario's Parliament and kind of gives its name to our Parliament, Queen's Park, there's statues of Queen Victoria and Edward VII and so on. And the Crown, as I've said, is Canada's head of state. The Canadian head of state, the Crown, is represented by appointed governors who are actually recommended, though, by the elected government who that should be. So in other words, even though the Crown nominally appoints them, it's in fact part of the elected system in terms of appointed by the elected prime ministers and so forth. Nevertheless, because the Queen was around for so long, this sort of weird system that we have as having a different country's monarch being the Queen of Canada was normalized because of her very, very long tenure. So in the course of her reign, she reigned 70 years. Queen Elizabeth had 12 Canadian prime ministers. That included her fourth one, Pierre Trudeau, long-serving and really consequential prime minister back in the 70s and 80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Who was, of course, the father of the current prime minister, who actually met the Queen for the very first time as a baby or a little kid. So a long connection there between actually the prime ministers there too. When she died, there were several older Canadian members of the congregation who reflected a lot on her passing. And really, one of the ladies said, well, was comforting in a way was that she's always been there. So in other words, she'd had this kind of eternal presence as monarch, which is odd because, especially strange in the course of this particular moment in history because her reign is the longest of any British sovereign. So for example, there's a picture of her annual Christmas message where she gave kind of a message to the to the British people and all the Commonwealth realms. And that became kind of an old Canadian Christmas tradition. And it's actually one that I, as an immigrant to Canada, kind of adopted and would watch the Queen's Message every year and so forth. So, nevertheless, for most younger Canadians, I think, and especially because there's so many immigrants to Canada and so forth, multiculturalism is the more central theme of Canadian identity than maybe the older Canadian theme of Britishness. And I think that's also especially true for Canada, let's say, as opposed to maybe New Zealand or Australia, although they also have Indigenous populations, given the kind of size and importance of the Indigenous population, and then especially of the Francophone population, the fact that Quebec and other provinces, Quebec is majority French-speaking, and they're French-speaking people historically in Canada since before the British Empire conquered Canada from the French Empire. So anyway, that is one of the things I think that contributed to Canadian multiculturalism, which is really kind of promoted as a central theme of Canadian identity today. Here in Toronto especially, well, a majority of the population of the city are actually immigrants, people who were not born in Canada. And also, as of 2016, according to Statistics Canada, a majority of the people in Toronto are what Statistics Canada says are not a visible minority, which is to say they're not white. And that status of being a visible minority then is also massively diverse. You can kind of see there's maybe a third are South Asian, and 20% are Chinese, 15% Black, and so forth. But all of the different those could actually also be divided into different ethnicities among South Asian too. So for example, among South Asian is Sikh as opposed to Hindu or Muslim and so forth. So anyway, it is a kind of a not just one large minority or something like that, but rather a massive diversity that is experienced when you live here in the city, which is one of the things that attracted me to the city. It's one of the reasons why I moved here. So going back to the Queen and the Commonwealth, over the course of her 70 years on the throne, there were a number of former British possessions and Commonwealth realms and so forth that have become republics. And so as of today, there's only 15 remaining Commonwealth realms. The most recent of the former realms, which is to say a place, a country where the sovereign is also the constitutional monarch of that country, was Barbados back last year, 2021. And since the Queen's death, Jamaica, the Bahamas, Antigua, and Barbuda have all announced that they're going to hold referenda on whether they're going to, ditch the monarchy and become republics. So part of that is because, while there was a lot of familiarity with and respect for the Queen, there hasn't been, this entire time anyway, a lot of excitement for her heir, who's now been crowned as Charles III. So let's step back away from just the British monarchy to look at monarchy as it exists now in the 21st century generally. So in including those 15 Commonwealth realms, 43 countries today are monarchies, which vary from highly constitutional monarchies like the Commonwealth realms we've been talking about, and also places like Japan and Scandinavia, the Netherlands and Belgium and Luxembourg and so forth, where the monarch's powers are very, very restricted and constrained. In the course of the most recent few weeks, as the British government has kind of been reeling and has had its shortest reigning British Prime Minister in all of history, I was kind of looking up, well, what are actually King Charles's powers? Could he actually dismiss Parliament and force the Conservatives, instead of keeping on replacing their prime minister and making increasingly unpopular prime ministers, could the king actually, force a constitutional crisis and dissolve Parliament and force new elections or something like that? And it actually doesn't look like he can. So most of those powers are circumscribed, and so even though Parliament is dissolved or can be dissolved in the king's name, the king actually has to be asked to do it by the prime minister, and he can't actually initiate that. So in other words, the monarchy's power is very circumscribed in these constitutional monarchies. Whereas some of the other monarchies today in the 21st century, like for example Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states, are absolute monarchies. And in these cases, the monarch's power is essentially unlimited. They may have to have infighting within their own dynasty and so forth. But in general, the state institutions are entirely operating at the will of the monarch. And then in between that are places like Monaco and Bhutan and Morocco, where the monarch has a bunch of political authority, but there's also a bunch of authority held in the legislatures and other places in the government. So the monarch is not totally constrained, but is not totally absolute either. One of the things we might think when we're thinking about all of those absolute monarchies is really what's the difference between an absolute monarchy and a dictatorship. There's actually, I think, more dictatorships than monarchies right now in the world. But in general, I'd say that the difference between a dictatorship and an absolute monarchy is often a perceived lack of legitimacy on the part of the population. So the dictator is usually, or as often, a military leader who seizes control of the state. And so then the people don't have the same sense that they've always been reigned by somebody from the House of Saud or something like that, as in Saudi Arabia. And this is rather, they think of this as being some new guy that they never really thought of as being their king before, but who's now seized power. In some cases, like, for example, with Vladimir Putin, they can still exercise pretty much absolute power, and they also do things where they try to establish kind of a cult of personality, and they can become very popular, but they have not yet established the kind of legitimacy that they wouldn't be, let's say, in danger of, a coup themselves or something like that. The way, let's say, a monarch is usually has more security than that. However, some dictators can successfully establish a dynasty. A great example is the Kim dynasty in North Korea, which is sometimes called a hereditary dictatorship, but it's kind of become a de facto monarchy in the sense, Kim Jong-un, the current dictator or leader of North Korea, has taken office in 2012 from his father, who in turn had inherited that same office from his own father. So, and he now has more or less all the kind of trappings of a regular hereditary absolute monarchy. So, how does monarchies work? Succession and legitimacy. So we're probably most familiar, when we think about kings and queens, we think of the British system of succession, or what we do here in Canada, which is based on hereditary primogeniture, where the eldest child, it previously had been always the eldest son, and indeed it's going to continue to be the eldest son just because of, just it worked out that Prince William had a son first. But they'd already changed the rules so that if he'd had a daughter first, it would be the eldest child. But essentially the eldest child of the previous monarch succeeds. And so even though we're familiar with that kind of hereditary monarchy, it doesn't mean that all monarchies always operated that way. So many historic monarchies are, the ones that still exist are, or ones that don't exist anymore, were elective. And examples of that include the Holy Roman Emperor. So even though by the end the House of Habsburg had really gotten a pretty good sense that they were always going to get elected, nevertheless, that wasn't assured. There were hereditary electors who came together to decide who would be the elector and who would become the Holy Roman Emperor, the King of Germany, effectively. Another one of those is the Doges of Venice. So even though Venice was a republic, they would elect their duke, their doge, and it was through a very complicated process. We have a whole lecture on the history of Venice, and part of that was so that we could explain the amazingly what we might call Byzantine system that they had for electing their dukes, their doges. Anyway, in this case, in those cases, and as with the papacy, which is also a many centuries old, almost 2,000-year-old monarchy, where the candidate is elected by a group, in that case, the College of Cardinals, and then once they become the monarch, once they become emperor or doge or pope, the monarch is crowned for life or until they abdicate. So the previous pope before Francis, Pope Benedict, abdicated, he retired, and he's still alive. And now actually Pope Francis, who's in very poor health himself, has kind of talked about abdicating as well. There could be a situation where there's actually two emeritus popes if that were to happen. Okay, that's a background on monarchy. What about monarchy in Mormonism? So in Mormonism, James J. Strang is probably the best known person or character in Mormon history for having become a self-proclaimed king. We have had a whole lecture on James Strang. He's such a very interesting character in Mormon history. So he was one of the successors to Joseph Smith Jr., the founder of the Latter-day Saint movement. Strang himself then founded a successful Mormon colony on Beaver Island, the largest island in Lake Michigan, where he was crowned king in an elaborate ceremony. And that I knew about both from Mormon history, but also I heard about it a fair amount by living in Michigan. I lived in Ann Arbor many, many years. And I would say that this forms kind of one of the three main popular tales of Michigan lore. It's less popular than the most popular Michigan tale. Michigan loves to talk about the Toledo War that the territory of Michigan fought against the state of Ohio in order to try to take control or keep control of what was called the Toledo Strip, essentially Toledo and a little bit of northwest Ohio. And although Michigan and Ohio are big rivals in football and everything else. Anyway, so although Michigan lost, as compensation, they were given the Upper Peninsula. And so that's why Michigan has, these two parts. Anyway, that's one of the Michigan lore stories. Another one is that one of their first governors was the boy governor of Michigan. So the guy was actually 22 when he became governor of Michigan. He was a lieutenant governor before that, before the previous governor died. Anyway, those two are the other two big stories that I remember Michigan people telling, but the other one is the story of the king of Beaver Island. So as a result of the fact that this is also part of Michigan lore, the kind of historiography, the history of Strang biographies especially, has a kind of their own completely independent history than the rest of Mormon historiography. And that's because essentially people in Michigan who are interested in Michigan history have done a lot of research on this and have written their own articles and their own biographies of Strang. And specifically what normally happens most recently, for example, with the book by Van Noord, Assassination of a Michigan King, and another one by Miles Harvey, more recently, The King of Confidence, is that Michigan journalists tend to kind of rewrite a kind of a sensational Strang biography, which becomes kind of a popular book and so forth. Meanwhile, there is now an emerging historiography of history of Strang and the Strangites done by scholars of the Latter-day Saint movement. The most important study that has come out still on this is Vicky Speak's book, God Has Made Us a Kingdom, James Strang and the Midwest Mormons, and I really much recommend that book. So perhaps because Strangite Mormons today are very, very few in number. A lot of people think that they're extinct. They're not. They are kind of spread across, especially across the US in several places, but their core kind of really strong and vital congregation that still exists kind of down to one last congregation is in Strang's first headquarters in Burlington, Wisconsin, a place that he named Voree. And because they're really wonderful people, and I have a lot of Strangite friends and have gone into church with them many times and visited them and done a lot of research directly with the Strangites. Anyway, because though they're so few in number, historians have been less than charitable in recounting their story, or less careful. Sometimes historians don't want to offend, let's say, the entire state of Utah and all the Mormons by, they might want to scoff at some of Joseph Smith's claims and so forth, but they may be more cautious because they're more aware it's an ongoing living movement. People don't have that same caution about the Strangites, I think, which I think is quite unfortunate. And that even includes, let's say, LDS and also even Community of Christ historians who sometimes, write things that are kind of snickering about the King of Beaver Island and so forth. So, why was, a little bit more about Strang, why was his unexpected suit for the leadership of the movement so strong? So although he had been a very new convert at the time of Joseph Smith's assassination, by the late 1840s, Strang had really emerged as the most successful rival to Brigham Young's faction. So generally speaking, that was because Strang ended up replicating many of the same kind of things that Joseph Smith had done in his own tenure as a prophet. And that included, for example, being led to and digging up new plates, which is new buried, what he said were ancient records engraved on metal, which he then translated. And we have this, for example, as a facsimile of one of his plates, the Vori plates. I think I've also done I don't think I've done a lecture on this channel on it, but I have done a whole presentations on the decipherment of this. It's a really interesting artifact, the Vori plates. He also translated and created an entire new book of Mormon scripture called the Book of the Law of the Lord. Additionally, he made similar claims to Joseph Smith, which is things like he'd been visited by angels that appointed him to be the prophet, and so forth. Strang was also a successful colonizer. So the Mormon colony he planted on Beaver Island was actually very economically successful, and it began kind of really growing and taking off at kind of the same time when crops were still being eaten by crickets in Brigham Young's Great Salt Lake Basin settlements. In the very first years of living out in Utah, it wasn't particularly clear that the colony there was going to survive. It was a very completely previously unsettled territory. The Brighamite Mormons directly forced out the natives there and brought it under agricultural cultivation for really kind of in the new, very, say, heavy cultivation for the first time. And as a result of that, they caused a bunch of ecological upheaval that included all these new crops suddenly, led to all these new crickets and so forth. Fortunately, the crickets led to new seagulls, and they were able to ultimately to eke it out. But it wasn't clear that that was going to happen at first. And for a certain moment, they were still considering, well, maybe they're going to have to pick up stakes again, leave Utah, and either move to Vancouver Island in Canada or maybe to California. So Strang also kind of successfully fought down persecution. The U.S. federal government had arrested him for a time and tried to convict him. They didn't have their case together very well, and so he got acquitted. And once he was acquitted, it was very difficult to kind of try to do it again. It was kind of a big scandal that the prosecutors had overreached and all this kind of thing. Strang was also elected to the Michigan legislature, so Mormons had a tendency to block vote, and this was one of the complaints that their neighbors had against them, and that block voting allowed Strang to become a legislator. But he actually acquitted himself very well and was found by his fellow legislators to be extremely effective. And he essentially became the power broker for the kind of northern Michigan territory, northern Michigan region within the state of Michigan. Strang was also a theological innovator. So at the end of Joseph Smith's prophetic ministry in Nauvoo, Joseph Smith had kind of rejected the idea of monotheism and instead had speculated that God, the Father, had once been a man, and that men could become kind of like gods. And that essentially turns your back on monotheism and essentially all of Christian theology, and before that, Greek philosophical monism before that, and so forth. You're getting back into essentially theological polytheism and so forth. So that was a problematic idea, and it continues to be kind of problematic to this day. Strang modified those ideas about eternal progression. He said, yes, of course, humans can become exalted and godlike, following in the path of Jesus, who had once been just a regular man like you and me, but became a god. But he then rejected Smith's idea that Heavenly Father, what we think of as God, had once been a mortal human, and he therefore, like I said, isn't eternally omnipotent, omniscient, etc. Now, God still is God, but then Jesus is essentially becoming a God, like a lesser, non-omnipotent being. He's a different being from God, but is a lesser one, and in fact represents the model that all good Christians can follow. And so this is kind of a return, if we think about early Christianities, the different Christological controversies of the first few centuries in Christianity. This is a non-Trinitarian idea, a non-Trinitarian Christology called adoptionism, where essentially it's separating God, the Creator, the one God, from Christ, who is a lesser and who is essentially adopted and becomes the Son of God, adoptionism. So, however, so Strang also took ceremonial seriously. So early Latter-day Saints made a lot of claims that were extraordinary. They claimed, for example, that they had a new book of Scripture, the Book of Mormon, which had been written by golden plates, they claimed that God had given them exclusive authority on earth. They were the one and only true church. They took that authority seriously, and many observers who look at this very tiny movement, who's claiming essentially universal soul truth, universal dominion, and through kind of quirky ways, golden plates, ancient Jews came on boats to the Americas and so forth. Many observers have found some of these claims to be kind of absurd. But Strang and the Mormons took them very seriously. Strang took these seriously, and he then coupled them with ceremonies that were staged kind of theatrically. And so one of Strang's important leaders, early advisors, one of the head of his council was George J. Adams, an early Latter-day Saint who had also been an actor, and he also helped Strang do some of these ceremonies. An example is when Strang is creating kind of a new secret order that he's initiating different loyal members to. One of the things that they do is they use phosphorus, and he uses phosphorus, and then they go into the dark, and then it shows and things like that. And so it's in a way kind of cool, and it's having this neat effect. But then some of the people are like, well, wait a second, isn't this using phosphorus? This isn't really a miracle. This is in fact kind of some kind of a showmanship. And Strang's explanation of that is that all of the miracles actually, are making use of this kind of, divine power and things like that are inherent in substances and so forth. But you can kind of see where not everybody gets on board with ideas like that. And that's definitely true, for example, of this coronation ceremony that has made Strang so famous or infamous. So Cecilia Hill, who was present at Strang's coronation on July 8th, 1851, on Beaver Island, later recalled, she said, quote, "The ceremony took place in the tabernacle, a building about 80 feet long, constructed of hewn logs, but only partly complete at the time of the coronation. Like any young woman under similar circumstances, I was anxious to be present, and I managed to get into the tabernacle. At one end was a platform, and toward it marched the procession of elders and other quorums escorting the king. First came the king, dressed in a robe of bright red, accompanied by his council, Then followed the 12 elders, the 70, and the minor order of ministry, or quorums as they were called. And they're also all in amazing robes and so forth, whatever they had been able to have for the time. The chief ceremonials, she said, were performed by George J. Adams, the president of the Council of Elders. Adams was a man of imposing presence, over 6 feet tall, and he towered over the short-statured king, who made up in intellect what he lacked in frame. There's no doubt Strang was a very intelligent guy. Adams had been an actor, she remembered, and he succeeded in making the crowning of the king a very imposing ceremony. It ended by placing upon the auburn head of King Strang a crown of metal. The crown was a plain circlet with a cluster of stars projecting in the front. So, anyway, it's ceremonial, taking ceremonial seriously. So, monarchy, even today, depends on ceremonial, and often this includes costumes. And really, when you start to watch, for example, all of the amazing costumes that the British monarchy and nobility and everybody around them kind of engage in, you can kind of think at a certain point, with some of the hats and so forth. This is also true if you're looking at some of the amazing papal and cardinals and all of the other ceremonial costumes and so forth, what the Swiss guards are wearing. The line between regal and silly is potentially quite blurry. But nevertheless, people take it very seriously, obviously. And Strang decided that he was going to go all in with this. Taking his claims seriously, and he's also going to do ceremonial in the most kind of theatrical and dramatic way they were able to on the frontier on a new settlement up in Beaver Island in the 19th century. So, just thinking about this, it's Halloween yesterday, and I was walking around and people are all dressed up. Maybe a lot more so than in the past. It's become, in addition to being a children's holiday, an adult holiday, and indeed it's a holiday that has kind of exploded around the world from just being a kind of a North American holiday to obviously being very important in Asia and other places. And it seems to indicate, I think, that people kind of do have a desire to wear costumes, but nevertheless, they feel that they need to have an excuse to make it legitimate for them to do it. You can't just walk around wearing a costume all the time because you'll be seen as being crazy or weird. But if you can have something to legitimate it, like a Halloween as a holiday, then you can go ahead and spend all month long or 2 months or however long planning what you're going to wear and that kind of a thing. And I'm just going to take an aside here. When I was talking about this with Mike, my husband, yesterday, he has an idea for Canadian Halloween. So it's actually really warm in Canada right now, but it's normally kind of Halloween comes and it's pretty cold, and so it's very difficult for people to spend all this time in costumes to kind of walk around, and they have to still wear their coats and everything like that. And so in the same way that Canada celebrates Canadian Thanksgiving a month before US has US Thanksgiving, Mike was saying we should make our holiday that we have in August that's called Civic Holiday. So it's a holiday that just has nothing to it, Civic Holiday, But anyway, we should make that into Canadian Halloween, because then all the Canadians would be able to walk around in the costumes when it's warm, but it would also be a huge tourist draw, because all the Americans who want to wear costumes more than once a year, they could also come and it'd be warm enough to do it. I think it's a great idea, so I'm passing it on to all of you. All right, let's get back to the topic. So ceremonial. So in taking that ceremonial seriously, I think that Strang was actually emulating Joseph Smith Jr., who actually created a number of rituals himself, the biggest one of which is really the Nauvoo endowment ceremony. It's a big, long ritual play, which he adapted and was inspired by contemporary Freemasonry. So he kind of started creating this just a month or so after he himself was inducted into the Masonic order, and kind of saw how Masons were using ceremony and ritual and so forth. And so the endowment included costumes, included robes for people to wear, hats, veils, aprons, and then even special garments, a union suit style underwear that had kind of markings on it and so forth. So it's not like there wasn't precedent for this already in Mormonism prior to Strang. Also, in taking the title of king, Strang was again emulating Joseph Smith Jr. So in the last year of his life, Joseph Smith, who had already claimed to restore the one and only true priesthood to the earth, and then afterwards, the one and only true church, now in a secret ceremony meeting with a council of 50 men, that becomes known as the Council of 50, or sometimes it's called the Constitution of the Kingdom of God on Earth. Joseph Smith claimed to restore that kingdom of God on earth, and at a meeting of that council, the Council of 50, on April 11th, 1844, the council secretary wrote that Smith was chosen as our prophet, priest, and king by hosannas. So at the end of his life, Joseph Smith then claimed to have become the king of the kingdom of God on earth. And indeed, Strang, in becoming king, was never meant to be crowned as king of Beaver Island. That's what the non-Mormons said. He was again following Smith. He's the king of the kingdom of God on earth, God's kingdom. And then they just happened to be on Beaver Island in the same way. Joseph Smith here is in Nauvoo. He's not king of Nauvoo, but he's king of this nucleus or embryo of a kingdom that's going to spread and fill the whole earth here in the end times, the latter days. So, to look at the idea of prophet as opposed to king. So after the founding of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, as described in the Bible, biblical prophets tended to be institutional outsiders. The kings of those kingdoms controlled the political authority, and actually the high priests controlled the religious institutions. So the high priest in Jerusalem was actually the person that was in charge of the Jerusalem temple and sacrifices and so forth, not prophets. So prophets instead were outsiders, but as outsiders, they were able to criticize kings and priests as kind of gadflies who were speaking the word of God with moral authority. And so there's a pretty stark story where King David commits an abuse of authority, where he has an affair with the wife of one of his military officers, Uriah the Hittite, and then in order to try to cover it up, he tries to bring Uriah back from the war and get whatever pregnancy that might result to be not come back on him. Since Uriah continues to be completely loyal and won't go and be with his wife, David decides to have the guy killed, or let the guy be killed by sending him in the front lines and pulling the troops back so that he'll get killed by the enemies. And so for this kind of horrible abuse of authority, the prophet Nathan rebukes David, in front of his entire court and so forth. So this is not a position of a guy in authority, it's a person who is speaking truth to power. And likewise, all through kind of the prophetic books, Isaiah and so forth, the prophets are actually criticizing the way that the priests are offering sacrifice. They're saying you're spending all of your time doing rituals and sacrifice and animal sacrifice and so forth, and meanwhile, people are in poverty. Widows are going hungry and so forth. Nobody's actually doing the charitable works that should be the part at the base of our religions and so forth. So that was essentially the role of prophets, speaking truth to power to high priests and kings and so forth. So although Joseph Smith is best known today by the title of prophet, at the end of his life, he'd actually created or amassed for himself many numerous titles. So Joseph Smith had begun his career as a seer, and then he claimed to be a prophet, a revelator, a translator of ancient texts, became president of the church, president of the church's high priesthood, which evolved into the first presidency of the church. He was ultimately the mayor of Nauvoo, the lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion. He was the head of the municipal court, head of the city council, et cetera, et cetera. So it was an amazing concentration of authority by the end. So far from being an institutional outsider, like a biblical prophet, Smith actually concentrated all of the religious, civic, legislative, judicial, and military power of Nauvoo into his hands, so that society. And so, in overtly assuming the title of king, I think he kind of really did establish a monarchy, although it was only in embryo physically, he predicted that it would eventually and actually quite soon fill the whole world. And like many monarchs at his time and today, he really preferred by the end of his life to walk around in military uniform, which is kind of how you'll see King Charles running around in very formal occasions too. So it is pretty common in Latter-day Saints studies to look at the church and the early church and its different expressions through the model of a kingdom. We're using the word kingdom, the prism of kingdom. So for example, when the New Mormon history got going in the 60s and 70s, some of the early really important books on the subject, one is called Nauvoo, Kingdom on the Mississippi by Bob Flanders. Another one is called, it's about Joseph Smith and the Nauvoo Kingdom period. And there's another one called Great Basin Kingdom by Leonard Arrington about the settlement of Utah. And I mentioned, of course, Vicky Speak's book, God Has Made Us a Kingdom. So in other words, the kingdom of the Midwest Mormons under the Strangites. So although historians very frequently talk about Latter-day Saint kingdoms, it's actually pretty rare to consider the prism or model of kingship for Mormon prophets, with the exception of James Strang. Nevertheless, I kind of feel like there are a number of ways that monarchy is also an instructive prism through which to view Joseph Smith's other leading rival successors. So in other words, not just James Strang, but also Brigham Young and Joseph Smith III. So in the first place, Joseph Smith was actually working in some instances, from the model of kind of inheritance. So inheritance by a lineage. And he had models for that, both in terms of priesthood and in terms of kingship, by looking back to the Bible. So the Bible includes, several precedents for lineal succession of priesthood and kinship. So the Levitical priests, the Levites, according to the Bible anyway, were all supposed to be from the tribe of Levite, one kin group. The kingship, for Judah anyway, was heritable from among David's house. So they're all descendants from David. And indeed, the loss of the Davidic line is one of the major biblical mysteries, but also tragedies. So people were upset in the Hasmonean kingdom, the Maccabees, because the Hasmoneans were not from the house of David. In other words, they're from a different, unrelated new royal house. And there were a lot of Jews at the time who felt that they were therefore not legitimate, since the true king should be from the Davidic line. And indeed, one of the reasons indeed why the authors of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke created genealogies for Jesus was to say that Jesus is from the house of David according to kind of prophecies of the Messiah and so forth. So in other words, lineal priesthood for the king. Similarly, the high priesthood is said biblically to all be handed down through Aaron's line, so the descendants of Aaron, Moses' brother. That includes Zadok, who's the high priest until the time of King David, and the Zadokite tribe thereafter, or sub-tribe, coming down to the Sadducees at the time of Jesus. The Book of Mormon makes the claim that its future translator, Joseph Smith Jr., was in fact a descendant of Joseph of Egypt. So Joseph is one of the sons of the patriarch Jacob Israel, and is therefore one of the Israelite patriarchs. So having established the Smith family's august lineage, going back to the biblical patriarch Joseph, in 1833, Joseph Smith Jr., it gets a little complicated here because the founder of the movement is Junior. He has a father who's way less important, Joseph Sr., and he has his son who's one of his rival successors here. We'll talk about Joseph III. So Joseph Jr., the prophet, restores this office, which he calls the office of presiding patriarch. It's also interchangeably called the office of presiding evangelist for his father, Joseph Smith Sr. And so one of the then focuses of the office of presiding patriarch, it's mostly an honorary thing. So he lets his father sit in the highest pulpit and so forth and sort of preside over everything, but not actively, right? But he also is in charge of giving evangelical or patriarchal blessings on the model of what Israel gives biblically to each of his 12 sons and so forth. And so that becomes a sacrament. Actually, it still is a sacrament. Community of Christ is still an ordinance in the LDS tradition. So then on Joseph Smith Sr.'s deathbed in 1840, he ordained his eldest surviving son, Hiram, so Joseph Smith Jr.'s elder brother, Hiram, to be his successor as presiding patriarch by right of lineage. So in other words, he doesn't go to the church doesn't decide who the next presiding patriarch of the church is. Rather, it's the family that decides it, and they're doing it by right of lineage, and he establishes that precedent then, that there is a lineal descent for priesthood. So after the death of his own brothers, Joseph, Hiram, and Samuel, William Smith was the last surviving brother of Joseph Smith Jr., the last surviving son of Joseph Smith Sr., and he was able to temporarily achieve recognition of his right to hold the office of presiding patriarch, presiding evangelist from both Brigham Young initially, and then later when Brigham Young and William didn't get along and they broke up hard again, William wrote to Strang, and Strang recognized his claim, and then Strang and he also fought, and William broke up again. So in other words, both in succession, Brigham Young and James Strang, for a time anyway, recognized William's claim to that office, but actually his nephew, Joseph III, never did give him that recognition. So he got that from the first two churches. And in between, though, William further claimed the prophetic office himself and the presidency of the church, which he claimed were heritable. So in other words, he should be having those as well by right of lineage. And he, in his own church newspaper, uses Jesus' brother James as a precedent. And so William argued, well, in fact, even though the Catholics make a big deal of the fact that Jesus gave the keys to Peter and said that Jesus would build his rock upon Peter, and therefore Peter is the first Bishop of Rome and Pope and so forth. William said, if you actually read the Bible, it turns out that Jesus' brother James was actually the guy in charge, and that Peter deferred to him at the Council of Jerusalem and so forth. And so that shows that, in fact, when the main guy dies, who should get it? The brother. And so it's kind of a self-serving argument that William made, and when he organized his own short-lived church, he took the title prophet, seer, revelator, translator, patriarch, president over the whole church. So he had a big, glorious title for a handful of people that were willing to follow him for a little bit of time. So there ended up being a fairly fraught relationship with this office in both the LDS and the Community of Christ traditions. So in the LDS church, the presiding patriarchate continued to pass lineally to various members of the Smith family in Utah. The last incumbent in that office is a guy named Eldred G. Smith, and he was given emeritus status in 1979, and was kind of alluded like, well, he's gotten really old and he should be allowed to retire and so forth, which is a kind of an ironic thing for an LDS general authority, since there's all tend to be so very old and never go emeritus. But anyway, they did it for this particular office. And then, and the second ironic thing is he continued to live on then until 2013. And so a long time as an emeritus in that office. And when that happened, the LDS Church abolished the office, and with it, the last remaining vestige of lineal succession in their tradition. Second. So, in the reorganization, so Joseph III kind of waited for his uncle William to die, rather than have a big fight with William or anything. He wasn't going to recognize William's claims because of the problematic guy that William was. Nevertheless, once William was dead, he called his brother Alexander, who's another Smith family person, of course, to the office. Then descendants of Alexander and his brother, David Hiram, continued to be in that role, in the role of presiding evangelist, until 1958, when Graceland professor Roy Cheville became the first non-Smith presiding evangelist in the community of Christ. So let's look also at Joseph's, the prophecies about Joseph III's succession as, again, a kind of a monarchy building thing in Joseph Smith Jr.'s administration in his time as prophet president. So in his role, again, as presiding patriarch, Joseph Sr. gave his grandson, Joseph III, a blessing, predicting that he would one day succeed to his father's office. This prophecy was reiterated then by Joseph Sr.'s son, Joseph Jr., the prophet, on several key moments in his life, including awaiting trial in Missouri, and then the last thing he did immediately before giving himself up for arrest in Carthage, where he's assassinated. So Joseph III, there were lots and lots of people in the church who kind of then assumed he would be the successor. Nevertheless, when his father was assassinated, he's only 11 years old. And in monarchy, that's always a problematic time. So when you have the king die and the successor is a child, that means a minority rule, and that's always a time for a time of instability in a monarchy. Nevertheless, there was no immediate successor then in 1844. I think in part because the general impression was that Joseph III would eventually succeed to his father's position, and then coupled with his age of 11, in other words, is too young to be the leader of a church. But those are among the reasons both Sidney Rigdon and Brigham Young suggested temporary leadership alternatives. So Rigdon asked to be named guardian of the church. In other words, he wasn't going to become the successor, the new king, but essentially he would serve as the guardian, which is, in my opinion, a title that kind of even almost sounds like the titles that regents would assume in Britain when monarchs were underage. Nevertheless, Rigdon was not, at the time, a popular choice for regent, but in some ways, Young's proposal that was set forth in 1844 was kind of equally temporary. His idea was, instead of having a successor, you can allow the 12 apostles as a whole council to act as the first presidency, essentially becoming kind of a, regency council. So then after defeating Rigdon as president of the 12, Young assumed the role of acting president of the church. Privately, Brigham Young would acknowledge Joseph III's future role. In other words, he says that boy will have his day, but if we were essentially to put him forward now, his safety would be in question. So essentially, we'll have this time period where the 12 are acting as the first presidency, and in part that's in order to secure the safety of Joseph III, whose father has just been assassinated, right? Okay, nevertheless, for the bigger picture, if the church members had hoped to make peace with their Illinois neighbors, Brigham Young was the wrong regent to install. So Brigham Young was part of the faction of the church that was very much in favor of polygamy and some of the other illegal activities that were going on that were causing all of the rage among non-members, including, for example, abuse of the Nauvoo Charter, abuse of the court system. And so when, in retaliation, the Illinois legislature revoked the Nauvoo Charter, the organizing document that made Nauvoo's municipal courts and law and everything like that exist, so suddenly those didn't exist. Suddenly there were no more courts. None of that was authorized. None of that was legal anymore. Young's response to that was to simply go outlaw. So now, if you're not going to let us be in charge of our law, we are going to be lawless. And so instead of abusing the charter's habeas corpus rights and things like that, as had been happening, now essentially they organize what's called like whistling and whittling brigades. So large groups of kind of big thugs who whenever a non-member enters Nauvoo, they whistle and they follow them around and are essentially marking their presence, and then they get close to them with big knives and they're whittling in front of them and so on. They're threatening people to get out of town. And so that's kind of the operation that happens. Rather than abolish polygamy, which is a source of a lot of complaints by the proto-Victorian neighbors of the young American Republic, who are very opposed to this familial sexual innovation, Brigham Young massively expands the practice. And indeed, because of all of that, because essentially with Young in charge, no compromise with the Illinoisans seems possible, the Illinoisans are effectively threatening to use the militia to call it the militias to force everybody to comply or kick them out or something like that. And so by 1845, Brigham Young agrees that he and his faction, all the people who are loyal to him, are going to leave the state and head west. Meanwhile, though, there was also a breakdown of relations between Brigham Young's administration and the Smiths. So Brigham Young was a Joseph Smith loyalist. His motto really had always been, Joseph Smith, right or wrong, he's going to do whatever Joseph Smith wants. And I think he may have been willing even eventually to see Joseph Smith's kind of clear vision of his son's succession happen. So in other words, he might have been willing, even though it was at the cost of his own rule, to let the boy eventually, when he grows up, succeed and become the next king and so forth. But he wasn't going to do it if that kid is totally opposed to everything that he stands for and all of his ideas and so forth. In other words, he has to be a little bit on board. And unfortunately, that path then is completely foreclosed because of the very serious conflict between Brigham Young and Joseph Smith's widow, Emma, who is an ardent opponent of polygamy and sees essentially everything that Brigham Young does once he becomes acting church president as being wrong. And so they essentially get to further and further apart. And at a certain point, Emma decides and is very clear that she and her family are not going west. Brigham Young cannot take Joseph Smith's bones or any of his documents that she still has possession of or anything like that. She's going to be through with him and his organization. So essentially then that divides Young's group from the Smith family. Brigham Young and his loyalists, including most of the population of Nauvoo, began their migration west in February of 1846. So Emma refused all attempts, either carrot and stick. So neither enticement to bring her to go, or cajoling her to join them, or letting some of the kids go, letting the son go, or letting us take the bones or anything like that. In other words, she refused on all counts. So forced to leave Joseph Smith behind with his mother, while on kind of route after his settlement begins in Utah. Young comes back to the kind of along the Pioneer Trail to their place in Canesville in what's now Iowa. He decides to fully reorganize his faction of the church. And so if we kind of are seeing this, using this model, we're kind of seeing him previously as acting more in the role of a regent for an underage heir. Now, having lost control of the heir or not having the heir in his immediate group or faction, Young decides to assume the prophetic mantle for himself. And so on December 27th, 1847, he creates a new first presidency with himself as church president. This is a statue in Council Bluffs, Iowa, of Brigham Young, commemorating his reorganization of the church, his founding the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. There had been a lot of people who were fine with kind of Young and the 12 acting as a regency council, who were not on board with Brigham Young becoming the successor. So for example, the apostle Lyman White had been one of the people imprisoned with Joseph Smith Jr. in Liberty Jail after the events of the Missouri Mormon War. And Lyman White remembered very clearly and witnessing Joseph Jr. Blessing his young son, Joseph III, saying, "You are my successor when I depart." So along with people like Lyman White, who had gone to Texas, who established his own kind of very successful Mormon colonies and the Pedernales and the kind of Texas frontier with Mexico. People like Alphaeus Cutler and the presiding bishop, George Miller, who had kind of been leaders in the pioneer trek west, they now break with Brigham Young as well over this idea that Young now, after 1847, is claiming the succession for himself. So if we look at this through the prism of monarchy, like I'm trying to think about, and why, and I think there's some good reasons for it. The technical name for a king who has come to the throne having seized it from a rightful heir is a usurper. And that's a negative term, but not all usurpers are bad or unsuccessful kings. So William the Conqueror, William I of England, actually achieved significant success in his reign, and actually the whole Norman conquest and all of everything that has come from that, the legacy of that is pretty incalculable, since modern English and everything like that is partially exists because of this combination between the Norman French and the Middle English, the Anglo-Saxon that was previously there, that became Middle English and then modern English once it's combined together. Nevertheless, William the Conqueror faced a very significant challenge to his legitimacy. There was a certain point when, after he's been accepted king for a while, there's nevertheless a very large rising, including most of the remaining Anglo-Saxon nobles who were then gotten rid of, and that's one of the reasons why there's almost a wholesale decapitation of the old Anglo-Saxon nobility, and it's all replaced with Norman nobility. So in a lot of cases, their instability, that they have, as opposed to, in comparison to, let's say, a king that was born king, forces them to act or react more than they would have to because of their shaky or unstable nature of their reign. So even if, once they've assumed, for example, all of the roles, all the ceremonials, they've had the anointing or anything that is causing them to be legitimacy, usurpers never achieve the same level of legitimacy that somebody who was born in the purple, somebody who was born royal, born to be king, essentially has. And that, like I say, makes their rule relatively unstable. Monarchy is always a little unstable, but this makes it a little bit more. I mean, an example of this is Richard III at the very end of the War of the Roses. So Richard III had been the regent for his nephew, Edward V. He'd been a very loyal supporter of Edward's father, Richard's brother, but nevertheless, at a certain point, he made the decision that the realm would be stronger, or he'd prefer it if he were just king instead of Edward. And so he put Edward and his brother in the Tower. They became the princes in the Tower, where they were lost, presumed killed by Richard. And so then Richard became king himself instead. So instead of regent, he now is the king. And the fact that he was a usurper made him weaker when the Tudor claimant, the Lancaster claimant, Henry Tudor, invaded through Wales and started attacking, trying to raise a force to overthrow Richard. Richard's force was much more powerful. Henry Tudor had a kind of a miserable claim as a pretender to the throne. He was not a very strong claim in terms of his lineage or anything like that. But because Richard had this kind of unsavory, usurpation that in his background, some of the nobles who had their own independent armies, they were able to kind of make the calculus and kind of at the right moment sort of betray him and essentially make Henry Tudor the new king, the new usurper. And this is, again, happens just because Richard had less legitimacy as a result of his own, path to the throne. So, nevertheless, despite kind of that background, despite the troubles that kind of Brigham Young had in terms of securing his leadership, He has all of these different rivals, everybody from Strang and so forth, but there's even more of them who he fights off. They had all of the trouble establishing the Utah colony with the crickets and everything else. Nature was against him, and indeed also the federal government he ends up picking a big fight with, and they have a whole Utah war as the federal government tries to replace him unsuccessfully. He's never able to, they ultimately kind of decide that they can't get rid of him, but he's never able to be, they can't work directly with him either. Nevertheless, Brigham Young successfully established the Mormon kingdom in the Great Basin, and all of his rivals had pretty much passed away or failed by the late 1850s. So, having achieved a very substantial victory, it was no doubt unwelcome news to Brigham Young in 1860 that he was now going to face the threat of a pretender. Joseph Smith III claimed the prophetic mantle on April 6, 1860. So in the language of monarchy, a pretender is someone who claims to be the rightful heir to a throne that they don't actually hold. So let's, for example, pretenders. After the Glorious Revolution in 1688, King William III and Queen Mary II of England usurped the throne of James II, who was deposed. Thereafter, James, who died, his son James, continued to claim to be the true heir, and people then called him kind of the old pretender to the throne. And then his son, who's better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, was known as the young pretender. And so these guys, you know, for James, the adjective for James is Jacobite. And so the Jacobite pretenders inspired a whole number of unsuccessful risings and revolts, especially in Scotland. And that just essentially made the British monarchy less stable because it was always susceptible to pretenders who were trying to overthrow them, who always had the support, of course, of the French, who just loved to do that kind of thing against their British rivals. Nevertheless, pretenders don't always fail, and so they can actually be especially dangerous usurpers. So after, in the 12th century, after Stephen of Blois, who is a grandson of William the Conqueror, after he usurped the English throne from Matilda, the daughter of Henry I. Henry had had all of his nobles swear that Matilda would be the heir, so she was going to be the acknowledged heir. It was going to pass to a woman. That was going to have been a first time that that happened. And so as a result of that, Stephen kind of had a snap coup and got him across the channel, went to London, Westminster, had himself crowned king in a fait accompli. And that resulted then in 20 years of civil war from 1835 to 1854. So Matilda was almost beat Stephen. She captured him for a little while, but it went back and forth, and eventually she was in the losing position. And so she transferred her claims to be the pretender to the throne, to her son, Henry Plantagenet. Eventually, after more civil war, Henry successfully had Stephen acknowledge him as heir. And so he then succeeded when Stephen died the next year as Henry II. And I'll mention that Matilda's story, the story of that civil war, is inspired George R.R. Martin. So HBO's current House of the Dragon series is based on, in part anyway, on this idea of that English Civil War, the usurpers and pretenders that resulted from a king naming his daughter as heir. These very same themes of usurpers and pretenders, that dynamic, that's very central to the previous Game of Thrones series as well. So Daenerys Targaryen is a pretender, so she's claiming that she's the true heir to the Iron Throne, and that this usurper, Robert Baratheon, who was just a noble who fought a civil war and seized the throne, he's a usurper, he's not the true heir, and that causes all of this Game of Thrones, this entire instability that leads to the whole civil war of that series. So let's look a little bit at Joseph III as a pretender to the throne, the Mormon kingdom. Joseph III, on his balance sheet, possesses a number of assets that bolstered his claim to his father's mantle. So in the first place, of course, as we recounted, his father prophesied that he would one day take his place as successor and also appointed him to be a successor. He also apparently looked like his father and even sounded a lot like him too when he spoke. And of course, he even had the same name, Joseph Smith. On top of all this, Brigham Young was not, he was definitely a strong leader, but he wasn't necessarily a particularly charismatic or popular leader. And he lacked a lot of any cause for why he should be the leader. In other words, lacked any particular ideas for why is he the leader, what makes him legitimate. He said it was essentially, for me, it's enough that this people has me as their leader and so forth. In other words, he's in charge, so that's why he's leader. So in the wake of the threat of a pretender now, Brigham Young and his loyalists now were forced to create new arguments to legitimize his reign. And so they hadn't needed these before, but now that there is a pretender, now that Joseph III is exercising these claims, now loyalists to Brigham Young, they begin to recall that they remember, hey, way back in 1844 during that debate between Brigham Young and Sidney Rigdon, they remembered that they'd had this vision at the time that Joseph Smith's mantle the heavens had opened, Joseph Smith's mantle had descended on Brigham Young, and Brigham Young's visage had become Joseph Smith. And so, of course, this is actually anachronistic to the time because, as we saw, he didn't actually become the successor at that time. He was simply proposing that the 12 act as the first presidency, temporarily leading the church and so forth. And two, actually, some of the people that remember this most vividly, their accounts of it, were not actually even in Nauvoo at the time and so forth. So in other words, this is a convenient memory because they are in need and looking for legitimacy claims. They also start talking about, well, Joseph Smith had given keys to all of the different members of the 12 and so forth, keys to the sealing power and things like that. But again, the purported revelation that Joseph Smith gave about keys is that no man, save it be one, can have the keys on earth at a time except for one man. And so in other words, according to Joseph Smith anyway, you can't distribute keys like that because they can only be held by him while he's alive and so forth. Okay. Another thing that Brigham Young and his administration did was fight Smiths with Smiths. So as Joseph Smith III and his brothers go on preaching tours and they kind of claim why Brigham Young is not the true successor, why they should be in charge and so forth, Young assigns their cousin, Joseph F. Smith, the son of Hiram, who's about the same age, to follow around after them to refute their claims, to kind of show, well, we have our own Smiths too. There's the blood of both prophets that were martyred are both Joseph and Hiram. Joseph's son is saying all these things, but Hiram's son is saying, follow Brigham Young. One thing, though, is that this had the dangerous effect of actually elevating Joseph F. Smith's stature and his own potential leadership claim. And so at a certain point, because people in Utah were excited kind of about Joseph F. Smith, there was a sense that maybe after Brigham Young dies, maybe his successor should be Joseph F. Smith. So maybe that should be the successor. And that obviously wasn't Brigham Young's plan. But by fighting Smiths with Smiths, you're kind of elevating Smiths. This is, in fact, Joseph F. Smith's extended family, so all of his wives, children, children's wives and children, and so forth. And so polygamy. So ultimately, however, I believe anyway that Joseph III failed in his role as pretender. He left essentially Young secure in his control over Utah. And why? Because in the end, I think Joseph III was far more committed to his opposition of polygamy. So he was constantly going around and telling everybody in polygamous Mormon Utah that polygamy is immoral, that you are not following any true doctrine, that you all have to end this practice, stop sinning, and so forth, shaming them, sexually shaming them, that kind of thing. And the problem with that is, even no matter what we think about polygamy in terms of as a moral abuse of women because of eliminating women's rights, making women's marrying age go down, this kind of thing. And the problem with it is, once you are already intertwined in this, and this is your entire familial system, it's not, you can't easily have it end by simply saying, oh, well, then we were mistaken, let's not do this. This becomes your entire family structure, your entire economic structure. The only way you can dissolve this is dissolving families, causing suffering, harm, and so forth. So it wasn't he doesn't have a very practical alternative to offer everyone, nor a very charitable offer or option for them, on the one hand. And then two, the second thing is that he's more concerned at the end of the day with clearing his father, Joseph Smith Jr.'s name. Joseph III would very much like to believe, I think he's not always sure he can believe, but he would like to believe that his father did not start Mormon polygamy, that Brigham Young started Mormon polygamy. And so he would say he believes his father is a good man. A good man would not have started polygamy. I believe my father was a good man, so I don't believe that he started polygamy. Unfortunately, everybody in Utah was very aware from actually, in many cases, firsthand experience that Joseph Smith Jr., his father, had been this origin of Mormon polygamy. And so Joseph III is not a credible spokesperson when he doesn't have his facts straight. And so those two things made his claim fail, because frankly he was more interested in those two things than he was, for example, of freeing the Mormon people from what I really think of was more Brigham Young's tyranny. And had he been more worried about the people, I think that he would have been more successful. So what was left? So as a result of this, in the course of Joseph III's long administration, his own reign, he's essentially king of his own smaller rump kingdom. So he's never the leader of the Great Basin Kingdom, which, let's say, at the time of his ascension in 1860 had maybe 80,000 members to maybe 300 Community of Christ RLDS members. By the time it was pretty clear that he had lost, in the middle of his term, the LDS Church in Utah had grown to 195,000 members, was maybe 25,000 RLDS. And by 1910, by the end of Joseph III's life, there's about 400,000 LDS members and 61,000 RLDS. So in other words, they're not totally out of whack, but it's clear it's a much tinier, let's say, rump kingdom that the Smith dynasty actually continues to control, as opposed to the larger Utah kingdom, the LDS Church. So although Joseph III failed to take control of the Utah Church or to bring a really substantial percentage of its members into his own reorganization, his bid did have several effects. So one of those, as I mentioned, was the elevation in part of the Hiram sons, the Utah Smith families and so forth. Brigham Young had hoped to establish his own dynasty. He had named several of his sons as apostles, including some of them as secret apostles. And he'd hoped, for example, that his son, Brigham Young Jr., would take over after him. Now, ultimately, because he had been forced to legitimize his own ascension, so in other words, why is he in charge? Well, he has to kind of say, well, the way it's supposed to work is that the senior member of the apostles, the president of the 12 apostles, should always be the successor. And by saying that it was legitimate for him to be in charge, that suddenly makes it so that his son is not the true and obvious successor. The legitimacy that should happen is the next president of the 12 should be in charge. And so Brigham Jr. is not able to succeed. Indeed, after Brigham Young's death in August 29th, 1877, there is a bunch of backfighting who is going to be able to take over. The interregnum ensues, and it lasts until 3 years later on October 10th, 1880. At that point, the president of the 12, John Taylor, was finally able to put aside potential successors, either from the Young family or from the Utah Smith family, so Joseph F. Smith and so forth, who ultimately succeeds, but he succeeds because of his order in the rank of apostles. So again, because they had retroactively legitimized Young's reign, all successors to the LDS Church presidency have followed that very same path. So in other words, every single time the president of the LDS Church, the prophet of the LDS Church dies, the senior apostle, the president of the Council of 12, then succeeds them. And so as a result, it's become kind of an oligarchy of all what's actually 15 apostles, which is becoming and has become increasingly geriatric. So the leaders are older and older and older. And so, for example, today, Russell M. Nelson is the LDS Church president. He's born back in 1924. He's been in office since 2018, and he's 98. That is not a particularly unusual. He's maybe a little bit older than they usually are, but they've been in their 90s almost my entire lifetime, mostly in their 90s. And so this is simply going to continue to happen because of the way they have legitimized the succession process. It has become the monarchy in the LDS tradition is now a geriatric oligarchy there's no changing how the succession happens. So meanwhile, back in the Community of Christ tradition, so the familial succession occurred from 1830 to 1996. So we mentioned Joseph III in 1860. When he dies, he had appointed his son Fred M. Smith to be his successor. Fred M. Smith appointed his brother. He had two daughters, so he doesn't have a son. He appoints his brother, Israel A. Smith, to be his successor, and Israel A. Smith appointed his brother, W. Wallace Smith, to be his successor. And then finally, W. Wallace Smith appoints his son to be his successor, and W. Wallace Smith is actually the first one of these men to then abdicate like Pope Benedict did. So he essentially retires and becomes emeritus prophet when his son, Wallace B. Smith, becomes the church prophet president in 1978. And so then Wallace B. Smith, we'll mention here, I had already mentioned about how the presiding patriarch evangelists in Community of Christ had been in the Smith family until Roy Cheville was the first non-Smith, and that it created a precedent for ending lineal succession. So what had been, let's say, the most lineal succession part of the church, the presiding patriarch evangelists, became a non-Smith family thing in the 50s. And so that set a precedent for having non-Smith Community of Christ presidents. So in 1996, the last Smith president, who's still alive, the emeritus prophet of the church, Wallace B. Smith, appointed W. Grant McMurray to be his successor, and he became the first non-Smith prophet president. And then Grant McMurray resigned from office in 2004 without appointing a president. So now we have a situation for the very first time where there is neither appointment nor Smith family in terms of how do you pick the prophet president of Community of Christ. And so what ended up happening, people sometimes compare it to what happened in 1844, but it's actually not. So Stephen M. Vesey had been the president of the Council of 12 Apostles, and so it looks superficially like what happened with Brigham Young, but actually he was not the senior most apostle at all. He was actually one of the younger apostles. And the kind of the pretense, the message in the overall church was the church altogether discerned who God was calling to be president and prophet of the church. And then that discernment process was focused on the 12, and then the 12 actually elected him. And so that's kind of how Stephen Vesey became that. But now as Stephen Vesey has gotten to retirement age, kind of the question is kind of looming, well, what does the future hold? So the two former ways that Community of Christ prophet presidents were kind of seen as legitimate, it's like from a monarchical standpoint, was One, that first originally that they'd been part of the Smith family, well, that got superseded. And two, that they were appointed. But would it be legitimate, or would a successor to Steve Veazey be legitimate just because he now appoints them? Or wouldn't that then again call into question, where did he come from? And so in a sense, because there's this idea of a discernment process that essentially Community of Christ as a prophetic people all came together to select him, it somehow seems like to legitimate Steve Veazey, what might make sense would be for a process like that to be formalized so that Steve Veazey's successor, again, is come together as a prophetic people discerning who the successor should be, rather than having it be Smith family or appointed. But, so in other words, is it possible that ultimately a world conference or some kind of a process like that will choose succession to the prophetic monarchy and Community of Christ? It's completely unknown, because actually we have no, I don't think there's any hint of what will happen, or I don't think Steve Veazey's given any hint that he's about to retire or anything like that. But he's at an age when historically he's a place in his tenure and age when Community of Christ prophet presidents begin to think of retiring. And so it is something we're thinking about right now as we're approaching for our next triennial world conference, which takes place next year, next April. Okay, so that was not a short lecture. I have had a bunch of requests. I liked it when your lectures were longer, and so I had a lot to say on this one. Hopefully you found it interesting. I know in some cases when we get into the quirkier topics about our own kind of tradition here in Mormonism and Community of Christ and things like that, that appeals to some of you more and it appeals to many of you less. And so hopefully you have found this and also the parallels to monarchy in general and the ideas of that somewhat interesting. And hopefully that's encouraged you to have some questions. And so we will go to those. There are some questions. So Ruth Goodwin asks, was James Strang charged with treason? If I remember correctly, Joseph Smith was charged with treason. So Joseph Smith was charged with treason in the Missouri Mormon War in 1838, and the aftermath of that, in the aftermath of 1838. And so he was in trial for that, and so that was where he was in that Liberty jail, which is to say a jail in Liberty, Missouri, while awaiting trial when he gave that blessing to Joseph Smith III. He later escaped from jail. They bribed a guard to look away and so forth, and they escaped and went to Illinois. And so one of the things that he had always hanging over him the rest of his life was that posses from Missouri would continuously try to go to Illinois and send writs that they wanted to arrest him and bring him back for a trial in Missouri, which he was able to escape from throughout his life. And he was actually charged with, I don't know if he was charged with treason again the second time. He was charged with certainly, anyway, it was charges surrounding his destruction of the press in Nauvoo for the second arrest. Although again, he wasn't tried or executed for that. He was assassinated by a mob. James Strang's trial, it is now escaping me. So that what he was exactly, what he was entirely charged with. So he was taken to and had a big long trial in Detroit, and I'll have to look it up again, the details. The main point of it that I remember is that the DA essentially had overplayed their hands. They didn't have the evidence to convict him. He was a very smart debater. He actually went through the whole trial and achieved an acquittal. And so that's what made him much more difficult for him to be tried again. And so indeed, when he was later assassinated, he's assassinated with kind of the fairly clear collusion of the US government. So a US Navy ship in the Great Lakes sails up to Beaver Island. They have some dissenters and Mormon enemies of Strang on board with a conspiracy that they're going to assassinate him. They call him down to the dock. He comes down without any bodyguards or anything like that. They shoot him, mortally wound him, and then the Navy ship takes them away and essentially as felony after the fact conspirators with them, actually before the fact and after the fact, and then none of those assassins are ever tried. So it is a kind of a, an assassination with kind of government collusion for James Strang. Leon de Berg asks, did Strang incorporate the Nauvoo temple rituals into his need for ceremony? So they never complete. They have definitely laid the groundwork for making a temple in Vori, but they do not actually finish a temple. So they build kind of a tower and they lay cornerstones and they're preparing to build one, but it's actually a lot of work and a lot of money, and they never achieve that. And so I'm not sure that they ever do the full endowment ceremonies and things like that. I'd have to look at that and see if they're doing that in a special endowment house, but I don't remember them having that. They are doing some of what become Nauvoo temple rituals. So for example, baptisms for the dead is a ritual that Mormons are doing in Nauvoo. It later becomes associated with the temples, and so LDS Mormons only do that in temples now. They did it in the river in Nauvoo, and they got the same kind of a idea for that in Vori, for example, and so they were doing it in the White River in Burlington, Wisconsin. Veronica Trains asks, how did the Michigan representatives react to working with a man who claimed to be a living prophet of God? So I think that a lot of them, especially initially, were indignant and they hated him and they thought that he was a fraud, and they didn't think highly of his claims. They thought they were spurious and so forth. Then what ended up happening that was like the first term when he first shows up. But then what's ended up happening is between the first and second terms, the legislature, which had been mostly a Democratic run in the Democratic Party, the Republican Party gets founded, and one of the places it's founded is in Michigan. And so it's a combination of breakaway Democrats and other independents and the Whigs, and suddenly all of the old Democrats are essentially swept out of office, and so almost the entire legislature turns over between the Strang's first and second term as a legislator. And so suddenly he's like the most senior guy in the legislature, because he's still a Democrat, because the Mormon vote is not subject to party pressure. They're going to all vote for him no matter what. So it doesn't matter what happened with the parties. And so as a result of that, his party's not in power, but he has got some of the most institutional experience. And so they end up overall feeling like, here's a guy who knows his stuff. He's very logical. He's able to have a good debate. He was able to understand the procedures and so forth. So I think that over time there's some respect, but some of that might be grudging respect, and certainly he still had to obviously watch his back. Like I say, he ultimately got assassinated. Leon asks, Roth also asks, does the current congregation of Strang continue with temple endowments? If so, how close are they to the Nauvoo endowment? So the answer is no. I don't think the Strangites, that's not part of the Strangite tradition. And so it's not like the Nauvoo endowment. The Cutlerites are the ones that have a Nauvoo endowment that's probably closer to the Nauvoo endowment. The Strangites are not doing that. The Strangites did continue to practice sealing into royal princely households. So this is the kind of thing that the Utah church abandoned already by the, 1880s or 1890s, sometime like that. They got rid of this. But this essentially was a thing where you would be sealed into Joseph Smith's princely household. So it's not just as a plural wife, but men would get sealed, like John D. Lee was sealed to Brigham Young as his kind of spiritual son, as part of his princely household. And this was part of these kind of temple rituals. That's been abandoned by the LDS church. The Strangites were doing that up until the 60s, but I don't think that they're doing that anymore either. So some of these things, they just decide it's not written down. We don't know the purpose of it. That's not part of what we're called upon to keep doing. Leon asks, is there any historical documentation to suggest the LDS Church president and a prophet is ordained the kingdom of God on earth when he's ordained to the president of the church, since it's done secretly in a Salt Lake temple during an apostolic meeting. I don't think that that's happening, Leon. No, I don't think so. So they continued to maintain the Council of 50. So Brigham Young continues to he doesn't really, it's not a source for him of his authority. They claim that all of the keys that are given to the 50, Brigham Young would prefer to just say, no, those were just given to the 12. And so that was his kind of idea. He calls upon them to meet a few times, and he makes it very perfunctory. It's a thing that Joseph Smith was interested in. It's a thing that Alphaeus Cutler was interested, that Lyman White was interested in. It doesn't seem like Brigham Young was very interested in it. John Taylor, who ends up being Brigham Young's successor, revives it for a little while, and so it continues, or gets a kind of a revived existence, but it doesn't, they don't really have a purpose for it, and so it doesn't ever anything come from that. Most of the kookier things, kind of like that, a lot of that stuff in the LDS Church doesn't survive the presidency of Heber J. Grant, where there's kind of he's kind of like a modernizer in the early 20th century sense, who doesn't want kind of the goofy. He is not kind of interested in the goofy stuff. And so they're very unlikely, in my opinion, that any of that kind of stuff is just kind of being done secretly anymore. But anything can happen. But I don't know of any documentation for that. Veronica Trains asks, how is the modern Strangite church organized, and where can you learn more about them? So you have to be careful. There's a bunch of different Strangite sites that is not run by the church. Essentially, there is a website, but it has a kind of complicated long domain name. Essentially, the church is the church that exists in Burlington, Wisconsin. And so if you're finding that kind of congregation that I showed the picture of, you can, and then you know that that's the site, and that's actually the church. In terms of how is it organized, so in the same exact way that there's an interesting thing in the succession thing in terms of the monarchy. So the monarchical theories, like I say, that the LDS Church gets locked into are the senior member of the 12 has to take over when the prophet dies, and so they get into this geriatric oligarchy. Community of Christ gets on this track of that whoever appoints the predecessor, and at first it really needs to be in the Smith family, and so that's how you do that. And then what about the Strangites? Well, James Strang made it very clear it is absolutely impossible for apostles to take charge. He makes it say in the book of the law of the Lord in Scripture that the 12 had no authority to do that. So he's retroactively saying Brigham Young and all those guys had no claim whatsoever. They would be apostates and in sin if they did that. And so Strang's apostles had no right to do that. They could tell that very clearly. And so they knew that wasn't the case. They also had Strang had also kind of said that Joseph III was going to be a successor, but Joseph III refused to acknowledge Strang as anything but a usurper or as a fraud. And so it has left all the people, so most of the Strangites did join the reorganization, but the ones that were left without a way to organize having a new head of the church. And so instead, they became organized through church conferences, essentially, where the leaders of different congregations would have a conference together, and that conference has an ongoing number of high priests. So most of the men in leadership are ordained to the office of high priest, and they make new high priests by high priests ordaining each other. And most of the women in the church are ordained to the priesthood office of teacher in the same way. And so it's organized essentially where there's a person is kind of the head of the church, who is elected by the conference. So anyway, they are on the web. You'd have to search to find them, but they're very interesting to find out about. Bob Garrison asks, did Emma want to be herself the leader of the church after Joseph Smith's death? No, I think she did not. She had her hands full, so she was pregnant and she had a bunch of young kids. She wanted William Marks to be the leader of the church. She thought William Marks was a very steady, respectable leader. He was the head of the presiding high council of the church in Nauvoo. He was a friend, a neighbor. And so she very much proposed that William Marks would be able to end kind of the negative practices and make peace with the neighbors. If Emma's plan had gone forward and William Marks had become the successor to Joseph Smith, I think it's completely possible that the church would have stayed in Nauvoo and it would have continued to be there as opposed to having any Utah settlement or anything like that. So Mike Rogers asks, is the prophet Russell M. Smith a monarch? And maybe that's probably Russell M. Nelson. That's probably what you mean. I mean, if there is no Russell M. Smith that I know of.
He means the prophet of the Mormon Church.
Of the Mormon Church. Is the prophet Russell M. Nelson? Is he a monarch? Well, he's a monarch in the sense that he has he's an absolute leader, like a pope or Kim Jong-un. In other words, he owns a sole corporation. The members of the LDS Church have zero input into anything. So in other words, he owns everything as a corporation sole. He could close all the churches tomorrow and take the $200 billion that they have in their account and not. I mean, they would have the break course of suing him in the U.S. courts or something like that. But essentially, he has total power. He can change anything he wants. So in that sense, he's an absolute ruler. He's a kind of monarch, I would say, yes, but I would call it an oligarchic monarch in the sense that it's a kind of a monarchy that is it's appointive. It has to go through the seniority of 15 people waiting for 14 people ahead of you to die, and as a result, it almost totally precludes any dynamism or charisma. You almost have to get to be in your late 80s or 90s in order to actually succeed, which is why he's a 98-year-old, a type of monarch, yes. Leon Berg says, did David Hyrum Smith ever consider himself to be a pretender? I worry that Joseph had put him away as a precaution. Joseph Smith Jr. had put him away as a precaution. Well, he wasn't born until after Joseph Smith Jr. After he was dead, right? So he's a posthumous son. So Emma is pregnant at the time of Joseph Jr.'s death, and then when he's born, Joseph had predicted he would have a son and that he should be named David. Since Hyrum also died, they named him David Hyrum. Many people who at a certain point were really doubtful that Joseph III was ever going to say, yes, I'm the successor. Many people thought, well, it just has to come from one of Joseph's sons, and many people saw David Hyrum as maybe an alternative. I don't think that David Hyrum himself ever put himself forward that way, because he was always very loyal to his older brother. So no, I guess I don't think that David Hyrum ever saw himself that way. Stephanie Ceresis asks, isn't dynastic succession planning a leftover from the days when many roles were hereditary? Seems like the practice is a geriatric anachronism. So yeah, it's definitely one of these bizarre holdovers for sure, right? And so, like we said when we were talking about at the beginning of this, what a weird thing to be in this country, Canada, which in some ways seems like it has no connection to the 1,200-year-old or however many year-old dynasty, monarchy that is operating over in the British Isles and yet, they haven't changed the money yet, but the Queen's still on the money and the government is still operating in the name of the new King Charles, right? And that is in some ways very weird. Nevertheless, I sort of feel like there are some, often when you're seeing very weird bathwater, you don't think there's any babies in there. I don't know. But anyway, so you think maybe shouldn't this be something that we just immediately get rid of? There are some weird human nature things about states and governments and so forth. And one of the potential things that you have when you separate head of state and head of government, like we have in Canada, is that you don't have to have all of the things embodying what and representing the state in the head of government, which is to say, you can really hate, Theresa May or Boris Johnson in the British system, and yet you still maybe, if there's some horrible tragedy in the United Kingdom, the Queen can go to the funeral and you can still mourn with the Queen because she represents the whole country, and you don't have to worry. Boris Johnson is your enemy as the head of the government, but you have you're part of the opposition or something like that. In the U.S. system, this gets really mixed up because the head of state and the head of government are the same in the office of the presidency, and so much is vested in terms of people's emotions and feelings in this office that it has gone completely off kilter ever since I've been, ever since I can remember, right? So all beginning in the 80s, people are so focused on the person of their partisan person being the president and representing the state, and then thinking about the opposite person as being, just a horrible enemy, that it has made, a partisan divide pretty amazing. And unfortunately, when you separate these two and you don't have this weird, quirky monarchy like the British monarchy, if instead you have if you're like a normal republic system like Germany or Israel, where they have an appointed president, nobody knows who the president of Germany is. You only know who the chancellor of Germany is. In other words, it's very hard for a ceremonial, powerless, meaningless president to seem meaningful in anything that they do and representing it as they represent the state. Essentially, the chancellor represents Germany and not whoever the president is, And so I don't know. I think that there's potentially I'm not saying this is the best thing in the world to have, but I think you can make some arguments for it based on those things. But yes, is it a weird anachronism and so forth? Yes. Ruth Goodwin, did Lucy Mack Smith acknowledge her son's polygamy? I don't think she talked about it. So I don't think that she was ever in the loop on that. So I don't think that she doesn't mention it in her book, I don't think, and I don't think we have any statement of her about it. So I would say that this is not something that he was talking to her about or teaching to her about. This was a secret practice when he was involved in it, and so I don't think that she was brought into the loop. Luke C. asks, is Mormonism the first truly American-born denomination? I would say, denomination. So it's hard to say. I mean, denominations, there's a lot of different American denominations. And so it's, when you're saying like an American religion, which I think is what sometimes people have looked back on Mormonism and saying, well, this has diverged enough from Trinitarian Christianity that it's in fact a new world religion, and so and it's a very American one, and certainly it's among the, let's say, the bigger and more influential American-born religions, let's say, and so that I would say is, but being first might probably not, because there's probably some little ones that you'd have to point out to that are born in the U.S. that are really American, but don't end up owning an entire state or having 6 senators or something like that, the way the Mormon Church does. Stephanie Ceresi asks, does God only call kings? You mean as opposed to queens, or do you mean as opposed to presidents? As opposed to anyone. Well, according to, our view in Community of Christ, all are called. And so that's one of our enduring principles. So God would call everyone, according to our view anyway, in Community of Christ. In terms of kings, kings often claim to be called by God, but claiming divine right is not something that all kings always do. And so it is not, it's not essential to kingship to have to claim divine right. It's something that a lot of kings do claim, and a lot of queens do claim, but it is not. It isn't an essential component of that. Beldame asks, I'd be interested to hear about the 1886 manifesto by John Taylor as a lecture. Yeah, so I think it would be interesting to hear. I think that might be a good topic for a lecture, is to even talk about John Taylor. So maybe you're aware, the very first pastor of the Toronto congregation was John Taylor. He is from, he's originally from England, but he was converted by missionaries anyway, and here in Toronto, and he became the very first pastor. And so I'm his I'm his 40th successor. I'm the 40th pastor. So he's an interesting fellow, and ultimately Brigham Young's successor, the second prophet of the Utah LDS Church. And so it'd be interesting to, a very ardent polygamist, and is in some ways the founder or organizer or legitimator anyway of ongoing Mormon fundamentalism. And so it might be interesting, like you say, to have a lecture on him. All right, well, thank you so much. That was lots of questions. That was a long haul. You can say in the comments whether you like longer lectures like this or if this is too much lecture. And we'll listen to that going forward. Thank you so much.